Sometimes your selections are going to need to have that soft edge, and as we discussed earlier, that is called an alpha channel. Well, an alpha channel is actually a black and white image. So just as an example, I'm going to start by filling a layer with black, and then I'm going to paint some gray, and I'll paint some white. And then I'm going to select this whole layer, copy it, and then I'll open the Channels panel, make a new channel, and paste. So here I'm looking at Alpha 3, which is an alpha channel, and it is black, white, and gray. Okay, nice and beautiful. Now I'm going to go back to selecting RGB, which means where I actually want to paint. And Alpha 3 is just saved in the document. I could even delete this layer where I drew it in the first place, and it is still in my Channels palette. Now to pull up Alpha 3 as a selection, I hold down Control and I click. Now the marching ants on screen don't really give a good impression of what actually happened, but let's see what it looks like. I'm just going to do a simple paint bucket fill with a very bright color. We'll do green. So let's look at what happened here. We have a solid green dot, a halfway transparent green blob, and nothing in the background. Well, let's click on Alpha 3 here again to see what that reminds us of. Aha! So white is 100% opaque, black is 100% transparent, and gray is in the middle. So in this case, gray gave us sort of a halfway transparent green. This is where alpha channels really shine. If you've ever seen any 3D modeling, one nice thing that they have automatically when they make a render is the depth of an image. They call it Z depth, as in the Z axis. Well, that could be really useful for us. Let's say we wanted to add some distance fog into our image to have it be very low contrast in the background, and then more and more contrast as we move into the foreground. Well, that to me sounds like a perfect opportunity for an alpha mask. So how would we build that? Well, I'm going to do it in black and white. So I'll start with a layer group here just so I can have some space to work with. And I'm going to start with least selected being in the foreground. Because remember, what we're essentially drawing here is fog. So it's going to be the most visible in the background and the least visible in the foreground. So I'll begin with black because this is going to be the stuff that's closest to us in the image. Now I want the inverse of the foreground elements to be a gray, and I'm actually going to do this on a different layer, so I'll make a gray color here. So there you can already see a little bit of depth. There is black in the most foreground, and then gray as it gets a little further away from us. So now I'm going to go ahead and select the background, and on its own layer I'm going to fill that with a color that is lighter still. And then I'll select the sky, and I'm actually going to remove sky from this. I don't want the fog to be covering up the sky. So in that case, I'm going to make the sky black, because remember, black means totally transparent. So this is pretty simple, but I'm going to go ahead and do a copy merged and hide this for a second. Open up my channels palette, make a new channel, and then paste. So here this looks exactly like what we drew a minute ago, but now it is called Alpha 4. So I'm going to go back to the RGB channel so I can keep painting. And I'm going to make a new layer. And if I just did a solid fill, we'll pick a nice fog color here. We'll do sort of a teal. If I just did a solid fill, this is what it would look like. Well, I want to apply the depth channel, the Alpha 4 that we just created, to mask this fog. So I will control click on Alpha 4 and apply that as a mask. So what you're seeing here is very thick fog in the background, less thick fog in the middle ground, no fog in the sky, and no fog in the foreground. And if I wanted to tone this whole effect down a bit, I could just lower the opacity. But what you see here is an alpha channel really shining. I'm able to control the selection's opacity per pixel, Where a path is nice for giving me a sharp silhouette, an alpha channel is great for giving me subtlety, nuance. Well, what if I want to make this less pronounced in the middle ground and really more just in the background? Well, I'm going to actually modify the alpha channel, but I'm going to first mess with this image we created. So I said I want it to be less pronounced in the middle ground. And the middle ground here is this sort of dark gray color. I just want to make that closer to black. So I'm going to lower those levels. And then this lighter gray color, I want to intensify it. I want to make it closer to white. And I could even hand paint in a bit of transition. So maybe I want to have sort of a slow transition here and a little bit of glowing to help it fade from foreground into background. And you could paint as much hand painting as you wanted to sort of smooth out that transition. And then I will select all, copy merged, hide that for a second. And I'm actually going to make a new alpha. So I'll click the new alpha channel, paste in there, and there we go. So alpha 5 is my new and improved depth channel. So I'll go back to RGB to continue painting. I'll make a new layer, do a fill with sort of a bluish color this time, like a blue-gray. So a solid fill with no nuance currently, but then I will control-click on our new alpha 5 and apply that as a layer mask. So here you can see there's a lot of fog in the background, even more than before, less in the middle ground, and even less in the foreground. Another use for this might be an adjustment layer. Let's say you want to increase the contrast in the foreground. Well, that sounds like the opposite of the depth we have currently. If right now the most affected is the background and the least affected is the foreground, I just want to switch that. So I will select our depth image, alpha 5, invert that selection, and then I could make a we'll do levels. And you can see by default, it applied the depth image as our layer mask. And you can see now I'm only affecting the foreground the most, middle ground a little bit, and background none at all. Another option would be to do photo filter. This is a nice way to add a bit of hue change. So here I'm going to we'll pick sepia. If we want to add a little more brown to the whole foreground, that's a way to do it. Now, in this case, I also have the sky included, and I probably don't want that. So remember, masks are always editable. If you are painting and you want to remove something from a mask, all it takes is painting with black. So here I've selected the layer mask thumbnail, and I'll just paint with black. And you can see the blue of the sky comes right back. And that just means I'm manually painting it. Now when I do this, I'm not actually changing the alpha channel. The alpha channel is here saved. I can't mess with it when I'm painting in my RGB channel. But if I do want to manually modify the alpha, I can do that as well. And in exactly the same way, I have my alpha 5 selected, and I can just paint with any color I want, as long as it's grayscale. So here I've added in a random squiggle. I'll go back to RGB, make my selection, and now when I paint with something very visible, you'll see that I have modified my alpha channel, because the alpha channel looks like that. Now, if you zoom in really close in the image, you can see there's a subtle repeat pattern on top of this rocks. It looks a bit like waves. Now, I actually created an alpha channel called wave patterning. And when I select this, the whole screen is going to blink. So this is what it looks like. Clearly, this sort of selection would be a nightmare to do by hand. But once I have this saved as an alpha channel, I can recall this with one click. So we'll go back to the RGB. I can make a new layer, call up my wave patterning, which as you can see has tons of marching ants. So I'll make a layer group and apply that as the mask. And just to make sure it's very visible, I'll use a really bright color here. And you can see that I have this very complicated selection to which I can paint inside of with no problem. So how would I go about making a selection like this? It's pretty straightforward, really. In another document or somewhere else in your current document, you just make whatever the repeat unit is and make sure it's on its own layer and just sort of build it in modular chunks. So I, make sure to build one unit in a way I really liked it because I'm going to be using it over and over. So it's important to make it look the way I want it the first time and not have to mess with it. So I'll make this one a little bit different just for kicks. And then I'm just going to flatten all those layers together and make a tile out of it. And for my purposes, I know I'm going to want sort of a long, tall, skinny chunk because I'm going to have to make this match the sort of 3D shapes inside of my illustration. So this is the basic unit. And as you can see, if I control click on that layer, it will pull up that selection because I did not draw it right on the background. These are drawn on their own layer. So with my base repeat unit created, I'm going to go ahead and drag that into my current document. And black is a little hard to see, so I am going to change the color of this. I'm going to do something very visible and very ugly, but it'll help us align it better. So now what I need to do is just make copies of it and using free transform, make it match the perspective of the image. And if you don't really understand how perspective works, you're going to have trouble with this, but I'm assuming you do at least have a general handle on perspective. Now I can use the warp command inside of free transform to wrap these around the forms inside of my drawing. So obviously this takes a while to do by hand, but it gives you very good control. So that might be the first piece. Then I'll select the original one again, duplicate it, make it a little smaller because it's receding into space, and then continue to use the free transform tools to make this in the correct perspective. So I'm not going to go ahead and do this in my entire image, but I'll show you how the process works. I would flatten those two together. Maybe I'd erase away part of the image where I don't want it. I could use my paths to help me with this. But then once I have it on its own layer, I'll control click to pull it up as a selection. I can even hide it if you want. Make a new alpha channel. So you can see it's all black. And I'm just going to fill that with white. So just like before, we have black as unselected, white as totally selected. So when I go back to my RGB channel to paint, on a new layer, I can control click alpha 6, which is the one I just made. I'll make that a mask. And now when I paint, it only paints inside of my newly created alpha channel. Very cool. Now, if you notice something's wrong here, I'd agree with you. This is painting over top of our windows. We don't want that. In that case, I'm probably going to want to modify my alpha channel so I don't have to go back and manually erase out the windows every time. But that's very easy since we already have paths. So I will go to my alpha channel and I'll open up my paths. And I want to select the window backing. So I'll control click on that. And now I'm just going to paint with black, because remember, black means not included in the mask. So black is now covering these window shapes. It's looking pretty good. I'll go back to my RGB channel. I'll delete this group here, make a new one, select my newly modified Alpha 6, set it as a mask, make a new layer, and there you can see it is only painting on the wall, but not the windows, which is exactly what I was going for. Now, obviously in a real painting situation, I'd probably not use this green color, but you can see how having that very, very specific selection is extremely powerful. I made it once, made it nice, and then I don't have to worry about it ever again.